because, to be quite honest, the pandemic changed quite a lot to the premise of the project. So let me get started and jump right into the presentation for today. The partners of the NORM Consortium are the University of Barcelona, Aristotle University, ELTE from Hungary, the University of Alcalá, UVSCRU, Versailles from France, VDU, Kaunas, EUF, the European University Foundation, as well as the European Student Network. What do we have in store for you guys today? Well, we are already right at the welcome and introduction part of this presentation. It won't be a presentation all day long, however, we have some group work prepared. So I'll give you a brief tour of the NORM project, where we started out, where we are at, which challenges we faced in between. We'll have a couple of impulse talks from members of the consortium. The NORM project in total had 6 intellectual outputs. We'll present very, very briefly summaries of these intellectual outputs. The focus of today's session is, of course, on the curricular matching tool, what we call the NORM tool, which was one of the 2 essential legs of the NORM project. And then we'll turn to our group work, which is basically based on something that we as consortium members struggled with just a little. Was how do we, primarily as international relations officers, implement a digitalization strategy at a higher education institution like ours? What are the most successful paths for that? We'll discuss that in groups, and eventually we will wrap up the session. The NORM project is of the 2019 generation, so that means NORM is a pre-pandemic project and also a pre-new Erasmus generation project. So at the time, the mobility target numbers were quite different than they are now. And we didn't know what the new Erasmus generation would actually bring, what it had in store for us. So essentially, we have a little presentation on the new mobility landscape with blended mobilities, with virtual mobilities, with blended short-term mobilities, with mobilities, third cycle mobilities. All of that, if you're interested in that, we'll discuss in a little more detail on November 22nd in a presentation where we focus not on the technical side of the NORM project, not the IT tool leg, but we're planning to focus on the curricular design guide, which is the other leg of the project. So essentially here you have the 2 legs, the primary goal to assist higher education institutions in improving the quantity and quality of student mobility, right? So both quality and quantity do matter to us. As we set out for the project. And then what we did was we wanted to look at identifying structural and systematic barriers. That is what we did in the first 3 intellectual outputs. And in doing so, we came up with a curricular matching tool, the prototype of a curricular matching tool, as well as a curricular design guide. Now, let's look at the curricular design guide. My colleague and I from the University of Marburg were in charge of intellectual output number 3, which was basically designed to focus on the bottlenecks of student mobilities, especially in highly regulated fields. So fields of education that are highly regulated, for example, by national regulation. Essentially what we found, however, in the process is maybe we're not quite there yet. Maybe we're not quite at the highly regulated field level. We are, however, still trying to make mobility the norm, establish it as a baseline. So considering that a mobility typology taking into consideration highly regulated field as opposed to establishing a baseline, making mobility the norm on average, that was going to be a challenge. So the access points that we had at the time were curricular design, That is, and what we analyzed is how do design degree programs, how are they structured? And how, in that regard, are they mobility friendly or non-friendly? So, for example, when we conducted the interviews, we asked in particular our interview partners, how is the international perspective translated into the design process of a degree program? And well, on average, one can sum up that the international perspective, or making programs mobility friendly, does not rank first or second in terms of importance when it comes to designing a degree program. Okay. Recognition procedures and national regulations, in particular recognition procedures, were something that we looked at in regard to, well, building a history, because we know that recognizing ECTS credits can be difficult, and there are different procedures in place at different higher education institutions, and that is something that we looked at. So all of this eventually is supposed to lead to the European Curricular Design Guide, which is the climax, so to speak, of that leg of the project. On the other hand, the question was asked, so, well, of course, we can have structural barriers in terms of the design of a degree program, for example, that we can tackle. The question was, how do students make an informed decision as to where they would spend their international mobility? And keep in mind that at the time, we were not thinking as much about the new mobility landscape, but we were having in mind the initial one semester Erasmus mobility. What we had known, however, at the time was that EWT was coming, and you basically knew what EWT was going to be all about, but not all of the details were known yet. So basically, NORM was designed to enable students to make better informed decision on their mobility, to enable give higher education institutions advice on how to design mobility-friendly degree programs, and translated that into a policy advice for a political level. I think we will now turn to short presentations of the four relevant intellectual outputs. And I saw that Nacho is here with us today. Nacho, I hope I'm not catching you by surprise. Could you just run us really quick through IO5, the desk research done by the University of Versailles?
Hello, everyone. I hope you copy me perfectly. And Johannes, well, has not caught me by surprise completely, as this has been, a long journey with all the partners here involved on the different intellectual outputs that we structure the work on in the NORM project. So when going back to the first intellectual output, this research report, one basic, Johannes has mentioned, which was the point of departure of this project. We thought important that before trying to identify different bottlenecks on the structure and academic barriers to mobility in Europe through intensive surveys, we need to know which was the state of art, or how the different institutions involved in these exchange programs, and how researchers and different stakeholders have thought about and have in the past identified where possibly the main obstacles and problems to what was something identified in the Commission as, and more generally in the Bologna process, as a general obstacle to these thresholds and these aims to get 20%, 20% of our students in mobility for 2020, and then they raised these intentions and aims later on within the European Erasmus Plus program. So in the test research, the main objective was just to look at the literature about mobility in Europe, in the European higher education. And out of that work, we got some basic clear common understandings where those obstacles were to be found. Of course, the first one was the level of funding of availability for mobilities, which we know that it has become, and it was in the past and is still today in different forms and shapes, a big obstacle and hurdle to motivate both the students and staff, but mostly students, to participate in the Erasmus Plus program, or more generally in an exchange program. Personal reasons were identified by many authors in the literature on this topic as another important obstacle. Personal reasons that would range from difficulties, personal family connections, financial difficulties, but also the fear that by being involved in an exchange program, students perhaps will not finish their studies in time, creating some, well, important headaches and preoccupations to them, and eventually advising them not to take part in these kind of programs. Most in the literature not only identify the obstacles but also the opportunities, as Johannes mentioned when we began this project. The now different kind of flexible schemes for mobility accepted and funded by the European Commission were just simply something on paper, like the blended intensive programs or short mobilities with virtual components. So many in the literature thought that not only was important to identify the obstacles, but also propose solutions. And there, it was pretty high in this in these works. The idea of creating a flexible policy for mobility, adding to semester mobility, traditional mobilities as we normally understand them, or the kind of shorter periods of time, like the blended intensive programs, would be a promising departure to solve most of the obstacles found. There was another problem identified, which was the lack of enough incentives for students to increase their participation in these programs. And it was not only about finances, fear of not finishing the studies in time, but also the added value of participating in that programs, exchange programs, next to the academic value of getting the recognition and transfer credits obtained once they are finished. So most of the conclusions in this research, and I conclude my brief presentation, turn our attention to the importance of something that Johannes has mentioned, how to look not only at the obstacles as such, but also as to look at how we design the programs, the different degrees, both at the bachelor and the master degrees, and how do we design the activities within the PhD candidates' activities. And that was basically one of the point of departures for the work in the rest of the intellectual outputs of in this project, and actually is served very well for the design of the European guide that we will mention and describe briefly later. Thank you very much, Johannes. This is for the summary for the desk research report.
Thank you so much, Nacho. Yeah, as you mentioned, the personal reasons for not going on a mobility, right? They were quite prominent in the desk research: funding, fear of prolonged relation, and language level. And they eventually found their way into the research that we did after that, and that continued. So we had our desk research, and in the first in the second intellectual output, then picked up on that research and did a quantitative analysis. And that was done by the colleagues from the University of Barcelona. And Ramon, I saw you somewhere here in my participants list. Could you really quite briefly share with us what you found in the second output?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I have prepared a PowerPoint, but perhaps could be too much. So just let me provide some very general information and findings. Okay, so the first point is that I would like to stress is that we launched two different surveys. Okay, one for students and the other one for staff. And what is important is that each of these surveys complemented, okay, and qualified each other. We obtained more than almost 3,000 responses from the student survey and about 200 answers from the staff survey. Okay, and the results were quite similar, which is nice. Okay, so both the students and the staff, let's say, had a similar perception of the barriers for students' mobility. Okay, and one of the questions that we asked for was the reasons why the students, okay, were not on mobility during their studies. Okay, and in both cases, from the students survey and the staff survey, we obtained as the first reason, and as expected, that income constraints was a major barrier. And this is Nacho has been talking about that. So income constraints is very important. But that second, we obtained the result that academic barriers were also very important. It was of a series of potential answers. Academic barriers, academic constraints were the most important ones, leaving aside income constraints. Okay, so then if academic barriers are important, which kind of academic barriers could be important? And in both cases, in both surveys, we obtained from a series of potential determinants that the possibility that mobility abroad can prolong studies at the home university was perceived as the main important barrier for both students and also the staff. Okay, and then there was another important concern about credit recognition between the host and the home universities. So, departing from these 2 points, that means studies prolongation and credit recognition, we tried to understand a little bit better what was behind these potential barriers. Okay, because studies prolongation could be connected to a poor institutional design. Okay, like weak incorporation of mobility in the curricula, etc. Okay, and also credit recognition could be also connected to institutional design. Okay, so the way that syllabus was constructed. So we elaborated more on that. Okay, I'm not going to provide the final results, but it was clear that here there were important issues. So in the framework of this project, the evidence that we obtained led to one important point. Okay, the importance to have good tools to match courses and curriculum among universities, among studies. And because of that, I think that it's important to implementing a tool that could allow this, and this could be also useful to avoid some of the barriers that were perceived as important by both the students and the staff. Of course, I can provide you more information on that, but I think that this could help us to understand a little bit more, let's say, the aims behind this project. So thank you.
Thank you, Ramon. Indeed, there was already the perfect segue into the today's basically primary actor, which is the NORM tool, right? Matching courses, course catalog information. Then I'll keep this very brief. Intellectual Output 3 was designed to focus on a typology of mobilities, right? What we did essentially was in 22 interviews, identified bottlenecks to international student mobility. And what we found that even universities with the best of intentions, that they would have a difficult time connecting with an IT solution, such as the NORM tool. Just to give you one example, the Erasmus program is structured right via ISCAT codes. So we have essentially faculty corporations most of the time. And the question then would be, in how many of our course catalogs do we actually carry ISCAT code information? And the answer is, well, not in not in a sufficient number. So that is something that we need to bear in mind. Pairing these information is difficult because unlike with EWP, where we have maybe a third-party software or third-party provider or our own systems, but EWP can function compared to the NORM tool in a rather narrow environment. So ISCAT codes, IT systems, the question was, how do we actually, in terms of IT, work with our international incoming students? In the interview, we took on two different perspectives, the interview partner as a sending and as a receiving institutions, and the way that they structure their mobilities. Okay. Funding, fear of prolongation, language courses offered in English, these things, they all came up. But with the exception of language or coursework offered in English, they were not as relevant to the design guide as well as the IT tool to be developed. In addition, so we interviewed these 22 people, most of them international relations officers, but also people from political bodies of universities and students. We also interviewed representatives from Akin and Annika, Spanish and the German accreditation agencies. And things that came up in these discussions were, for example, we asked ourselves, or interview partners basically rhetorically asked, do people nowadays live longer at home, or do they move out when they go to a university, the local university? And what does that mean for their international mobility later on? Now, if I had to summarize the finding of IO3, I think it is perspective matters. It is a sort of incorporation of internationalization as a perspective that matters when you design the very basics, structural basics of your university administration that is related to IT systems, but also related to degree programs. And with that, with a quick nutshell, I think I will hand over to you again, a short abstract from the curricular design and policy recommendation, and then we can dive into today's main actor.
Thank you very much, Johannes. It's going to be short because, well, tomorrow, as Johannes mentioned earlier in this presentation, tomorrow we'll have a devoted webinar just to the European curriculum design. The only thing to say now is that against this background defined by my colleagues, where student mobility and the multiplying forms that the multiplicity of forms that we have in our hands nowadays, particularly after, well, the experience of the COVID-19, It's the area where our guide will tell and will summarize how we can make our utmost with the elements and tools that we have in our hands. We don't need to invent, actually, and possibly we will not be able to invent from the different typologies of mobilities that we have, to introduce them in our daily work at the different programs that we taught at the universities, each one according to the characteristics of the program, sometimes just continue but enhancing semester mobilities, enhancing through the possibilities as the matching tool that today is going to be described will generate. Some of the times by introducing new types of mobility in the design of some of new degrees, or to modify some degrees to get the most that we have nowadays to enhance and increase the number of students that participate in that mobility. The guide as such blends very well with the different initiatives that we have, that we know that the European Commission is investing time and efforts, from the digital education plan to the initiative of the European Universities, to the European Universities Initiative, but also to some other important priorities that the Commission has put on the table for the current Erasmus Plus program, from questions connected to mobility to inclusion, and seeing how some of the obstacles that we have identified and have been briefly described today can be overcome by flexible, more or smarter way of using these schemes for mobility programs. But about all these, we will have time tomorrow for those that are today with us, and then they are interested in the more political aspects, I would say, rather than in the technological aspects that are the subject of today's webinar. Tomorrow we will have a devoted webinar on these questions, where we will try to show what is going to be our main product in this intellectual output 6, and the recommendations that will include for different stakeholders involved in these exchange programs. Having said that, thank you very much. I hope now I give again the floor to Johannes, and I'm sure that all of you will find today's webinar on the matching tool extremely interesting for your universities. Thank you, Johannes.
Yes, thank you, Nacho. So the working premise is, I think, if you, and I assume that many of you are international relations officers, quite familiar with the Erasmus program, when you ask yourself, especially in the context of the digital learning agreement that we are currently so desperately trying to implement into our processes, when you ask ourselves, when do we, or when does my institution publish its course catalog, and what information does it carry? So, for example, is my course catalog available in English? Which classes do I offer in English? We asked, this was one question, basically. When do you offer your course catalog, and what information does it carry? Was one information that we asked during our interviews. And to our surprise, we found that most of us, although we know that having accurate course information and being able to design a learning agreement in a timely manner is crucial to a successful mobility, our institutions publish the course catalog rather late. So if a university that starts its winter term in October, for example, only publishes its course catalog in August, that can be a challenge, because in August, basically, you want to have your grant agreement and your learning agreement. Well, at least you should ideally be far advanced in the process of creating your grant and learning agreement. Right, especially since in some countries the summer break is quite distinct, rather long. So basically, all three intellectual outputs that were research outputs, the desk research, the quantitative interviews, as well as the qualitative interviews, they all indicate, or well, they underline the operating premise that being able to compare courses, not in this way, but ideally in this way. So we're not talking about a one-on-one course comparison, but as the learning agreement suggests, a number of courses compared to another, table A compared to table B. Being able to prepare that in advance is important. I think all people that we interviewed underlined the statement. Being able to compare courses matters. Based on this, we developed, we further developed the procedures to be used in the matching tool. So as a matter of fact, that's an ongoing process, the matching tool, based on the research that we did. So the initial idea, for example, just comparing ISCAT codes is going to be difficult. Just comparing degree programs is going to be difficult, especially keeping in mind that there may be degree programs in one country that wouldn't be programs at all in another country. So highly regulated fields or regulated fields like physical therapy, for example, that you study at a university in one country and you do an apprenticeship in another country. So all of these were criteria that we took into consideration as we prepared the working premise, or basically narrowed down or operationalized, I think that's the word I'm looking for, operationalized the working premise for the NORM tool. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tiago from the European University Foundation, who is the coding and programming mastermind behind the NORM tool. And we gave him a hard time as participating universities or higher education institutions in the consortium, because providing access into the core of our IT structure proved to be a very challenging task to many of us. Tiago?
Hello. Well, thank you for that introduction. That is very kind. And honestly, I would not chastise you for not being able to provide access to course catalog data, because working with the institutions that did, I'm well aware that this is quite a big task. But in any case, we did make some progress. So today I would like to show you how far we've come with the tool, and hopefully you'll be able to see the potential advantages, especially when it comes to visualizing course structure and those kinds of things. So let me try to share my screen here. And let's bring up the NORM tool. So this is the latest iteration of the tool. We have managed to bring in some data from the participating institutions so far, and have a look at what the catalog shows. We also have a little bit of test data here for the moment, but insofar, we would like users to be able to see, first of all, what course that is in fact available, catalog that is available. You can have a look at the institutions for which there is a catalog. You can see what kind of programs they have included. You can filter by the level, all that good stuff. Now, you can get information about the program. You can see the courses that are included in each program. See which year, whether there's a mandatory course, even though it's a bit hit and miss. In other cases, you find, let's say, courses When available, we get information about the year in which a given course is delivered, in which term, and whether it is a mandatory course. For each course, you can also have a look at the programs where you might find it. So in this case, Introduction to Finance is included in the first year of the economics program and in the second year of business administration. In addition to this, if you're looking at a course and you want to find more information rather than the one we have, we do store some information: code, ECTS count, is it code word available, the language of instruction. We keep description, some learning outcomes when available, but in addition to this, we try to provide additional information that may come from a remote source. All of this hopefully would help to provide more information to the person trying to match curricula. And then, of course, we can establish equivalences. So if we put ourselves in the shoes of a student who's thinking to go abroad, for example, you might see what kind of opportunities they have. So let's say that we're based here in our office some degree programs. We do not have any particular equivalences for outgoing, but we do have other partners pointing to us. That means that our partners at another institution have taken the time to look at our courses and see what kind of matching they can. In this case, we found 5 course equivalences. So what is this about? This means that someone in the Brussels office pointed to the catalog of the Budapest office and went about trying to put together the corresponding courses for their first year and first semester. If we have a look at this, find, up here in Brussels, there's only 1 degree program. This is the way it is structured. You have mandatory courses all across. You have elective courses here. This should give us enough information. So coming back, I can already see that this was matched to this was matched to this, and so forth and so on. So when a student finds this, you can just grab the link and send it to their coordinator, hoping that, is this something that I can participate in? Would this be a good fit for me in terms of preparing my learning agreement? As you pass it to a colleague, you might find is, I forget who I am, sorry. Oh, I don't want Bob. I want Alice. This is the author of this thing. So the point here being that any coordinator in the institution can log in, can have a look, and can build their own course equivalence tables, which then everyone is free to browse and have a look. So at the same time, if you are on the receiving end of this, with your account, you see your institution, and you see that partners are pointing to you, you can consult these things. And as you do, you can have a look. So in this case, we are the partner. We have to take a look at what's going on the other side. So if I compare this first course that they're pointing to, it's in the first semester, and in my program, this takes place in the 3rd year. But if I look at what the colleagues are trying to do, I will see that their course takes place in the 1st year. So there might be a mismatch here. If they deliver this content in the 1st, and I deliver this content in the 3rd. Now let's go back to one of the feedback. And saying there might be a problem. write something very thoughtful. In different years, you might have a scheduling conflict if you sit in a student to complete this course, because all the other courses are in the first year. Save that. And so at this point, you as the partner have left some feedback in terms of this table that was built pointing to your institution. Well, on the other hand, that means that Alice over here, who created this, you can also see the feedback. Meaning that not only the tool allows you to map things, get good information or the best available information about the course catalogs, you can establish equivalence tables that you can use as the basis for your learning agreement, as the basis for curricular design. You can pass around the information, you can provide feedback to your colleagues, to your students inside your institution, to other coordinators inside your institution, or to colleagues from your partner institutions, to make sure that you gather the best possible information. So this would be my short overview.
I find that this is very relevant because when we first started out with the project, the idea was to give students the chance to compare, right, course information, course catalog information. But eventually, after having done the interviews and the initial review of the NORM tool, we found that there are different additional scenarios that the NORM tool can be used for. So, for example, what we found that depending on the design of the degree program, and in particular the mobility window, the modules and the courses that a degree program has within its mobility window, that there may be, for example, what some call import modules. So modules that a student can take from let's say a psychology student, not from the psychology department, but maybe the sociology or history department. That is entirely possible. But the Erasmus interinstitutional agreement of the psychology department is based on the psychology code, right? ISCAT code. So depending on the scenario, what I'm saying is that you may have, or if it's a student training to be a teacher, right? Depending on the scenario, you may have a student who goes on a mobility based on an interinstitutional agreement, which is more or less faculty-based, but has various mobility coordinators involved in the process. And only one of these mobility coordinators, especially in the digital times, in the digital age, is going to sign up on the digital learning agreement. So eventually they will have to communicate as the student prepares the learning agreement. And what we found was that the IT solutions, for example, those institutions using an IT solution to prepare the digital learning agreement, they had, for example, one coordinator or one faculty in charge of one particular cooperation, right, based on an ISCAT code, one interinstitutional agreement. However, they would not be able, in that case, to access information and make decisions for other colleagues, especially in terms of ECTS recognition. So when we transfer credits, and that is one of the bottlenecks towards student mobility we found. So if in this was one of the additional scenarios that Tiago just described, that coordinators can communicate with each other via the tool, prepare sample equivalence tables, for example, that is a huge benefit and adds a sense of security to the student, right? Because we have a communication on a level where it is sometimes not possible without a lot of effort, but the NORM tool helps with that. because coordinators can build a track record, can build sample tables, and they can communicate, especially if you have various if a student shares an equivalence table with various coordinators, they can communicate on that equivalence table in the system. Tiago, are we moving on to the group work?
Yes, we can. In the meanwhile, if anyone has questions, they can put them in the chat and I'll be happy to reply.
There's something in the chat. Oh, that's all you. Okay. Any questions to this point?